Okay.
Now you're on tape then.
Okay, so I sat down and started reading, and mainly the archaeology. I knew it was the fantastic literature on the priests and Levites in the textual analysis of the Bible. That's what I read in the last few weeks, and since yesterday I celebrated my 60th birthday, and I'm officially now in the Alter Kaker club, so learning something new is important. Let's move on. There has been a ton of research on the priests and the Levites in the context of the ancient Israel and Judah, most of it textual, and this is from Wellhausen and onwards. There's just an astounding amount. Most of the discussions, as I said, are based on textual analysis alone, with very little reflection on the archaeological materials. And there's a lot of debate about this, and just like in all aspects of biblical research, everybody is sure that they know the answer, and there's 17 different answers out there without any clear solution. And it's quite reminiscent of other aspects of dealing with topics such as cultic ritual aspects. There's aspects of the dietary law which are discussed ad nauseum almost, and it's really something that you get the feeling that it's a discussion without much relation to the examples. And when we talk about the priests and the Levites, so I can bring us several examples. Discussions of what the priests and Levites actually did. It's based solely in the literature on the analysis of the biblical text. A discussion of the so-called Levitical cities. The only impact with archaeology is they say, well, are the cities listed in there? Are they existing during certain periods? But even if they do exist during certain periods, there's any evidence archaeologically or historically that these specific cities ever were used as Levitical cities. So it's a very theoretical aspect. Numerous discussions on the history of the priesthood and the various supposed families based on the biblical sources. Who are the priests? Who are the Levites? What's the relationship with them? And most recently, a book that came out last year, Richard Friedman's book on the Exodus. He tries to talk about the distinct historicity of the Exodus, and he bases it on the fact that several of the Levites' names are Egyptian names, such as Pinchas and Hophni, etc. And he claims that this shows that the Levites were the original group of Israelites who left Egypt, and they brought with them this tradition. But again, there's no archaeological evidence to corroborate this. So I really have a feeling that we have to go back and ask, first of all, what's the relevance of the textual analysis for the Iron Age finds? And I would say that perhaps more than anything else, this reflects, one, the comprehension of the priests and Levites by composers, editors, and redactors of the biblical text, which can be, to a large part, after the Iron Age. And then the question is, how much of this is a reflection of the actual reality or their understanding of what should have been? And of course, and no less important, the modern reception of the text by the scholars, both modern and ancient and medieval. And again, how they perceived things should be based on their understanding of the text. And I would like to take this from a completely different angle, a book that was put out by Philippe Book in 2001, which deals with ritual text from the Middle Ages. And he writes two things, and I'll quote them. Texts were forces in the practice of power. They should not be decrypted for elusive facts about rituals and then set aside. And he goes on, ultimately, there can be no anthropological readings of rituals depicted in medieval text. There can only be anthropological readings of, one, medieval textual practices, or perhaps two, medieval practices that the historian has reconstructed using text with full and constant sensitivity to their status as texts. The latter is nonetheless much more difficult, especially for data-poor eras, and that's for sure for the Iron Age, less reliable, and allows only a circumscribed realm of appropriate questions and possible results. So, unless we have very strong evidence, I would say, Houston, we have a problem. But the question is, I think some people did. It's a famous saying that the astronauts on Apollo 13 said when they thought they weren't coming home. But the question is, how much a problem is this? And one can ask, are the biblical texts, and you'll excuse for taking it rather far off, are they for understanding Iron Age ritual as they're helpful as the Lord of the Rings is helpful for understanding medieval studies? Or can we find a little more meat on the bones? And for that, I suggest we look at let's be positive, look at the half-full cup, and say like this, that first of all, based on the large corpus of ancient Near Eastern texts, it's quite obvious that there were priests also in Israel. Even if we don't know what they did, how they did it, etc., there's no question that they were there. There is some archaeological data, and I'll show some of this soon, that enables a limited view of this issue. And I would like to bring the various, there will be inscriptions mentioning names associated with the priests, localized cultic practices in the Iron Age, perhaps connected to local cultic personnel, vessels with inscriptions or signs, probably or possibly relating to tithes and other offerings known from the biblical text, possible reflections of biblical cultic practice that may be associated with priests and Levites from the archaeological remains in cultic context, various other objects which I'll mention, and finally, this very, very controversial aspect of the DNA of the Levites and the priests. So let's start with the inscriptions mentioning names. So perhaps the best known is from the Arad Ostraka, from the fortress of Arad, where there's a temple. We have mention of Pashhur and Merimot, which are names associated with the priests, with the Kohanim in the biblical text. And for example, there's a bula from the city of David, which was found in an archaeological excavation, which mentions Gedaliah, son of Pashhur, again, according to the Jeremiah, an official in Zedekiah's court. But again, it's not mentioned that he's a Kohen, but perhaps the name Pashhur is connected to that. Then we have several bula. One second, something. Go back. Several bula that mention people associated with Chilkiyahu, and some come from excavations, some come from the antiquities market, and Chilkiyahu is a priest who's known in various biblical sources. So again, this might be a priestly name, and in fact, the one on the bottom, actually, Hanan, son of Chilkiyahu, the priest, is clear as possible. Then another very interesting thing, which I've written on along with Itzik Shai in this article noted below, we spoke about the fact that in Iron Age Judah, we have to speak of a much less centralized kingdom than it's very often portrayed, and there's a lot of local elites, or call them muhtars, who are leading the various regions, all leading up towards the city, the king in Jerusalem. And we spoke also about the aspect that there are also localized cultic manifestations, which again, if we try to turn this into something related to the priests, so perhaps in these local cultic locations, you would have a local priest. And again, some of the biblical texts hint to that as well. And one of the examples of this, which leads us to the other issue, is Iron Age vessels, which have been suggested, and I wrote about this in an article in JAWS in 2010, which might indicate aspects which are relating to things that are given into the temple. And for example, a very common iron 2B Judite cooking pot, which on the handles has a cross mark, which, if it's correct, it's a taf, and perhaps related to truma, the biblical heave offering. And this is based on also appearance in later periods as well of this abbreviation. The same thing goes in several vessels that were found at Arad and other sites in which you have an abbreviation of either it's written kadosh or kaf kufshin or kuf kaf, which has been suggested consecrated or consecrated to the priest. Here's an example from Arad. We have an example of another abbreviation, which is a kuf resh, which again has been suggested to be an abbreviation of korban, sacrifice, found at Kuntilat Ajrud, where there's clearly a cultic activity, and at the city of David as well. And then there's this vessel, which unfortunately comes from the antiquities market, so we can't be 100% sure that the inscription is real, in which it says, Le Matanyau yain nesech revi'it, to Matanyau libation wine, a quarter, again, most probably related to ritual activity, again, perhaps a priest. And of course, how could you not mention the ivory pomegranate with the inscription, Kodesh Kohanim Lebeit, a consecrated to the priest to the house of Yahweh. It's reconstructed, and unfortunately, most agree that it's a fake. For many, many years, this was bought from this was donated to the Israel Museum for, I think it was bought for $600,000 and donated to the Israel Museum. And for years before it was declared a fake, I would tell my students that they gave me $600,000. I'd bring back 2 pomegranates with inscriptions. They wouldn't be broken. But they never took me up on that. And if you go on, another very interesting aspect, again, we can't say this for priests for sure, but there are various activities, cultic activities at sites such as Ebal from the Iron 1 till Dan and Mosa from the Iron 2, which clearly indicate cultic activities. And particularly if you go to Dan, there's no question that there's cultic personnel. But beyond that, we just know that the cultic personnel were there. They had objects. We don't know very much beyond this. And there's another interesting aspect is that there are indications of faunal remains with specific usage of body parts. And this has been suggested at Ebal, Lior Horowitz's work, and recently in a yet unpublished study by Jonathan Greer from the Grand Rapids Theological Seminary, which should be out soon, he's suggesting very definite changes in use of body parts which should be connected to specific biblical texts. Since it's an unpublished study, I'll leave it at that. And here we say Dan and Mount Ebal, and this again indicates cultic behavior, but again, can we connect it to specific priests or Levites? That's another question. Of course, the famous priestly benediction scroll, the silver scroll found in a late Iron Age tomb in Jerusalem, which one of the scrolls is clearly an almost exact quote of the famous priestly benediction in Numbers 6. First of all, there's no mention of priests. And second of all, the fact that it's called a priestly benediction may be very much a later development and not a thing to do with what's actually happening in the Iron Age, even if it is an Iron Age text. Then, a very controversial aspect is, over the last 20 years about, various genetic studies have suggested that there's, if you look at the genetic markers of the modern priests, and the modern Levites, you can trace back unique aspects which go back 2,000, 3,000 years. It's very sexy, and that's why it gets published in Nature. But a lot of people don't agree with it. This is something that the geneticists have a lot of problems with. And more recently, it's not that recently, there was also a suggestion that Levites, and in specific Ashkenazi Levites, can be traced back to a specific group, I think 2,000 years ago, based on genetic traits. And again, there's been a lot of arguments, and I would say that from what I've spoken to people, the consensus is at most, let's be very, very careful with this. So even here, we can't really speak of something that goes back into the Iron Age or something of the sort. So what do we have? There is, I would say, quite clear evidence, both textual and archaeological, that there were priests in the Iron Age in Israel and Judah, and I don't think that's such a big thing. There are some parallels between the archaeological record and the biblical narratives regarding priests. Most of the biblical depictions on priests and priesthood did not have any reflection at all in the archaeological record. And I would say it's a question of that, is that something that's because there's no connection, or is that because the beings that would be indicative of this are intangible as far as an archaeological perspective goes? And add to that as opposed to the excavations in Mesopotamia, for example, Professor Charpand described as you excavate for a day, you find 7 tablets, and you excavate the next day, another 20 tablets and everything. If we find 1 tablet in 45 years, we're very happy. So the amount of textual corroboration that comes from the period, as opposed to a biblical text, which may be decades, centuries later, and of ideological nature, and not necessarily depicting realia, so we're in a much less secure situation. So I think, unfortunately, that's really all that we can say, and thank you very much. I'll let the chair run the... That, by the way, comes from the Brick Testament. It's a fantastic website where you have Lego depictions of all kinds of biblical scenes. It's a yeah.
Many hands, so thank you very much for your lecture.
Yeah.
It raises a lot of interest of the time.
Before any serious comment or question comes up, I would like to everyone. I am praying with a man in my synagogue. Next to me is a man who is a modern priest, and his name is Pons. And he explains to me that Pons is tapuach, is a apple. Okay? So he traces his genealogy to the second temple, the family of Tapuach, which is in the list of priests in the Mishnah.
Okay.
So we have been warned now by Mr. Pop.
Don't we have vessels from Shiloh also with Kuf, Resh, Tzadi, Tav, Mashu? Nothing?
From Shiloh?
No?
Not that I'm aware. But on the other hand, the people who excavate Shiloh don't believe in publishing, so they just don't publish what they find. So we have no way of. I mean, the current excavations that.
Actually strong. If it says Shiloh and it says Kuf or Tav.
Okay, I'm.
Maybe we have traces of priests that maybe were Jewish from Untitled Chapter.
I mean, we don't know. The names of the people of Untitled Chapter might have been priests, but it doesn't say that they're priests. So, I mean.
I don't know, you tell me, but I think they
Well, again, it could be that these are priests, and it could be other objects that have names on are related to priests. But if it doesn't say, Ploni, the son of Almoni, the priest, or the name of either Ploni or Almoni is very similar to names that we know of priests from the biblical text, then it's simply a guessing game. Oh.
I think in Tel Aviv there were a couple of inscriptions of Nassas or Ben HaNassas, the standard bearer. And they were found either inside that temple or close to it, so he may have been part of the Catholic person.
No, well, actually, the Nassas was found at Moza, but not next to the temple, slightly on the other side, like a couple hundred meters from it. It was actually found in a central storage area. So, but it could be of ritual cultic significance.
As more of an archaeologist, I wonder what kind of material culture or activities would be related to a cultic function, priest or whatever, that we could find archaeologically like. So disregarding any, like it's a prehistoric archaeology. Like what kind of activity? Is there anything like that?
Well, we have temples, and we have various cultic places where you have activities related to cult, whether it's incense, sacrifice, etc. But I mean, if you want to talk about how can I identify priests, if I have a very, first of all, inscriptions help, and if we have very specific locations associated with specific people, then I would assume that they are in a cultic personnel. More than that, it's sort of a guessing game. It's elaborate reconstructions. Yeah.
Just a short question to put your evidence in context. The inscriptions on the dedications for sacrifice or kadash and so on. Are these the only kinds of tiths and dedications, or are there other, secular tiths or dedications of vessels? So what other types of inscriptions do we find on these vessels, or are these the only?
Well, of the dedication vessels, those are more or less what I brought, what I showed. There are other inscriptions which tell us what type of wine or how much there is or where something is from, but it's, again, not something that can be definitively put into the cultic realm. Even here, again, the interpretation of these X's as related to Truma is a nice interpretation, but there's no proof to it. Yeah.
Yeah, you alluded to the situation at Ur, and precisely the question then which I asked myself is, had we not the tablets, would it be possible to recognize those houses as being inhabited by priests? And as far as I can say, the answer is no.
Mm-hmm.
So even in Mesopotamia, if you put the tablets aside, I think there is nothing which identifies those houses as inhabited by priests. So.
Okay. Yeah. Yes.
The seals you mentioned, were they found in temples or were they found in houses?
Excuse me?
The seals you mentioned,
Yes.
were they found in houses or were they found in
Some of the objects that I mentioned were found in cultic context, but some of them were just found in regular domestic, context. So it's again very, very problematic. Yeah.
And were these houses close to a temple or not?
Well, the finds at Arad were very close to a temple. The finds from Dan were close to a temple. The finds from Jerusalem, you could say that they're not far from a temple, but again, many of them are not. Yeah. So if I have time, and since I finished quickly, I'd like to tell a joke about the priests. May I?
Yes.
Yeah. So a Jewish man comes to a rabbi and he says, I'd like to become a Kohen. And he says, you can't become a Kohen. Either you are a Kohen or you're not a Kohen. So he says, well, how about for $500,000? So he says, he throws him out of the room. A week later he comes, Rabbi, I'd like to become a Kohen. I told you you can't become a Kohen. So he says, but how about $1 million? So he says, you know what, now that I think about it, maybe we can do some ritual that the Rambam did back in the, way back then. And they go through the ritual and he writes the check and he gives them $1 million and he says, tell me, Mr. Cohen, why do you want to be a Cohen? He says, well, my father was a Cohen, my grandfather was a Cohen, so I thought I'd be a Cohen as well. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.